Hi, everyone. Hope you are all doing well today. Today's session, we are going to be talking about specific de-escalation practices for youth that are impacted by trauma. So I will be going over kind of how trauma impacts the brain and then really diving into what does de-escalation look like. Today, we will be talking about and learning how to remain in control during high stress situations, learning how to avoid the wrong response, learning how to support our youth anywhere with any of their issues. And then we will be walking away with very specific strategies to support students at all levels of an escalation. So I'm sure many of you have seen this already if you have been doing any of my video sessions, but really quickly, I just want to go through it again so that we can reiterate what part of the brain we are talking about. We know that when we are in a high stress situation, when we are impacted by significant trauma or chronic stress, we are living in that survival brain, right? That reptilian brain, that fight, flight, or freeze brain. When we are having a high emotional response to a situation or to someone, our limbic system is triggered. That's that green area in the middle of our brain, right? And this is when we are impacted and triggered by high emotions. And then finally, we have our thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex and the neocortex. And this is the part of the brain that has and engages in rational thinking, making appropriate choices, our impulse control, those emotional responses, and really kind of thinking before we act on something. And this is our thinking brain. What we know about our thinking brain is that when we are living in our survival brain, our thinking brain is not being triggered. And so we went through all these, the thinking brain, that brain that the part of the brain that controls our emotions, and then our survival brain. What's also really important to acknowledge and remember, especially as educators, is that when our basic needs are not being met, we are also living in our survival brain. So if you think about your youth who are impacted by homelessness, impacted by neglect, impacted by hunger, right? Not enough food at home. They are living in their survival brain and their thinking brain is not being triggered, right? That learning brain is not firing. And it probably won't fire in the classroom until they get some of their needs met during the school day, until they get breakfast, right? Until they have your warm welcoming into the classroom. When we are in our alarm reaction, which is that survival brain, we have these different responses, right? We have our fight response, where we feel like the best way for us to stay safe is to fight off the threat. We also have our flight response, where we believe that the best way to stay safe is to run from the threat. And we have our freeze response, where we believe that the best way for us to stay safe is to freeze. So we're going to watch a quick video clip of this alarm reaction, right? So I want you to, as you're watching, reflect on these questions, right? What does the teacher do to decrease or increase the escalation? What could the teacher do differently? And how do the actions of the teacher and classmates impact the student's reaction?
So, why you pick this class anyway? It's pretty hard.
Oh, beautiful view.
All right.
All right. All right. Y'all shut up now. Now, last week, we talked about the physiology of the animal brain as it pertains to aggression. Now, is there anyone here that can tell me why most alligators are abnormally aggressive?
I know the answer to this question. Raise your hand.
Anybody? Anyone? Yes or you, sir?
Mama says that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
Your mama said alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush. Wow. Anybody else? Yes, a user.
Alligators are aggressive because of an enlarged medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls aggressive behavior.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata.
But Mama
The
said...
medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy, and aggression come from. Now, is there anybody here can tell me where happiness comes from?
No.
Anyone? All right. Let's hear what Mama has to say on the subject.
Mama say that happiness is from magic rays of sunshine that come down when you're feeling blue.
Well, folks, Mama's wrong again.
No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong. Mama's right.
Mama's right. Mama's right. Something wrong with his medulla oblongata.
It's okay to fight back. Coach Klein said I could. Mr. Coach Klein said I could. It's fine.
All right, so I am going to give you some time to reflect with yourself or with other colleagues that you're watching this with, and talk about these questions that I posed to you. But I want to just say and kind of put it out there. There are many instances where teachers kind of trigger that alarm reaction from the student. And sometimes it is completely inadvertently. I have done this before, right? I have done this before many times, not on purpose, whereas this teacher that we just watched might have done it a little bit on purpose. But sometimes you start to see that student's alarm reaction going up, 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 and then the big explosion, right? And then the big escalation. Whereas if we kind of disengaged in the moment, that type of escalation would not have occurred. So go ahead and pause on this recording to go finish off thinking about these questions and reflecting on these questions for yourself. And I'm going to continue. So again, I want us to think about, is there ever a time when stress is beneficial for us? And again, feel free, you can pause this recording and have that conversation with each other, or you can continue. But really consider, what are those instances where it is beneficial to have that high stress? Some examples of when this is beneficial, right? You hear about the parent who is able to lift a car off of their child, right? That is because of their survival brain. They are not thinking, you know, how much does this car weigh? Can I lift this car? That's not going on at all in their head. They are just thinking in survival, I need to protect my child. And so they're able to, through all of everything that is rushing through their body when that survival brain kicks in, right? Some of us work well under pressure when we have papers due, when we have work things due, an IEP due, right? And so these are other times where sometimes that little boost of stress, that extra little stress, is really helpful to get into this survival brain where we know we have to finish something in a certain amount of time. So we're going to talk about the optimal performance range for a little bit. And this visual that you are seeing in front of you, which is called the stress cycle, is based off of the curriculum of right response, which is a safe restraint and isolation curriculum for schools and group homes and community-based organizations to utilize when working with individuals who exhibit significant escalations. And so what you see in front of you is what we would call this stress cycle, right? We all have our baseline. That's where we walk in on any given day into work and we're feeling pretty good. Maybe you got your morning cup of coffee. Maybe you listen to a good podcast to get you going. We all have a specific baseline that is met when our morning is going the way it typically should be going, right? So for me, for example, I have to have some type of caffeine whether that's coffee or tea. I have to work out in the morning. My baseline is off. I am not fully myself if I don't work out in the morning. And getting a good night of sleep. I'm definitely one of those people that works best after 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours of sleep. And that is when my baseline is at its best, when I walk in and I feel the most prepared to work with my students. Our optimal performance range is when we are at baseline. And that's when we are in our learning brain. That's when we can get and gather new information and express ourselves comfortably and make those rational decisions. Now, as we know, there are numerous things that happen during the day that push us out of our baseline, right? So you wake up in the morning, and the first thing that you do when you pour yourself a cup of coffee is notice that you forgot to put in the coffee grounds the night before. So you just poured yourself a hot cup of water that tastes pretty gross. That would, for me, push me a little bit higher starting to go up into this alarm reaction, right? Then maybe I go into the shower and I realize that my partner used up all the hot water in the morning. And so now I just have a cold shower. Maybe I'm going into my classroom a little bit higher now, up that alarm cycle, right? Or this alarm hill that I'm kind of climbing, right? And then let's say I get to work and I have forgotten that I have an IEP meeting this afternoon, and today I don't have a prep period, right? Now I might be even a little higher up this alarm hill, right? So when my students enter into the classroom, I am not my best, right? I am struggling, right? I'm feeling stressed out. I'm irritated that I haven't had coffee yet. I'm irritated and I'm mad at myself and embarrassed at myself that I forgot about the IEP meeting later this afternoon, right? So I am pretty high up that alarm phase. And then I have my students walk in and I say, good morning to a student. And the student maybe responds and cusses me out, right? Let's just say, okay, if I am at my optimal performance range and a student cusses me out, it's no skin off my back, right? I ignore it and I walk away. Now that I am closer to that alarm reaction, right? Closer to that, it kind of looks like a crazy heartbeat up at the top of that hill, that alarm hill, and a student cusses me out. Now I might kick that student out of class because I just do not have the patience to be able to deal with it. All right. Now, of course, ideally, we are always in our optimal performance range, because what happens with this stress cycle, and we see it all the time with students, and I'm sure we all have experienced this before because everybody engages and has some type of stress cycle, is that once we reach that alarm reaction, that's when we pretty much lose control of ourselves. We're super frustrated. We're not thinking about what we're saying. Okay. And then once we start de-escalating, so once we start going down that alarm hill, we actually dipped below our optimal performance range into the exhaustion stage. And anytime we engage in the stress cycle, there is that exhaustion stage, which looks different for everybody. Some people fall asleep, some people cry, some people put the blame on others. Some people blame themselves, right? It looks different, but there is this change of energy when we come down from our alarm reaction phase before we go back up into our baseline or into our optimal performance range. It is really important for us, and this is an activity that I want you all to do, for us to figure out when we start climbing into that alarm reaction, what can we do for ourselves to bring us back down to that baseline so that we are in our optimal performance range? What does that look like? For some people, it's taking deep breaths. For some people, it's going for a quick walk, checking in with a teammate to make sure that they can watch the class for 5 or 10 minutes while we are taking a walk. I engage in a lot of positive self-talk, right? So I remind myself, my student's having a bad day. I'm not having a bad day. I remind myself this isn't going to last forever. I remind myself, you know what? There is coffee in the break room and you can go grab yourself a coffee. Or Uber delivers Starbucks, right? Get some Uber Eats. Doing stuff like that to remind myself that not everything is an emergency that I have to start creeping up into that alarm. I can stay at my optimal performance range. What we also want to avoid about this stress cycle is when we see our students engaging in this stress cycle, we want to avoid engaging in it with them. We want to avoid our mirror neurons picking up on their escalation, because that's when you go home every single night and you hit that exhaustion stage and you're exhausted and you go to bed at 6 o'clock and you have anxiety about going back into the classroom the next day and seeing that student. It's because of this. It's because of this stress cycle. The more that we can stay in our optimal performance range when our students are escalating, the more that we will be able to maintain that optimal performance range. And we know that many of our students come to school already really close to alarm reaction, already really close. Only one thing is going to get them into an escalation. And so it's critical that we know that about our students so that we can plan accordingly for how we are going to engage and interact with them. And one of the things that impacts our optimal performance range, or our ability to stay in our optimal performance range, are cognitive distortions. So cognitive distortions are really lenses that we see through that impacts our view of the situation. And there's 4 cognitive distortions that we're going to talk about. The first one is the victim mindset. And when we engage in a victim mindset, we have thinking patterns such as, it's all about me. These people are having a personal attack against me. Poor me, this always happens to me. Why do things like this keep happening to me? And the behavior results from these thinking patterns is that we can actually allow crisis to occur. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy for us. We might blame others, we'll be in denial, we might feel defeated or guilty, and we engage in a lot of negative self-talk. There's also a polarity mindset, and this is when we think in extremes. Everything is the end of the world, or nothing is of consequence, nothing's that big of a deal. Right? When we have these thinking patterns, we allow crisis to occur to feel better about ourselves. We kind of create the crisis, as a matter of fact. We're also not flexible. It's my way or the highway. I'm not a good team member because I don't think anyone else's opinion is as good as mine. I can't see another person's perspective. I become hyper-focused on one strategy, and I'm stuck on that strategy. I might also respond in extremes to a situation if I'm viewing the situation in extremes. The next mindset we have is the emotional mindset. And the thinking patterns is, I feel it, therefore it must be true. Now, I don't know about some of you out there, but my emotions don't always tell me the truth, right? And some behavioral results that might happen if I'm seeing a situation through an emotional mindset is that I might have an emotional outburst. I might engage in a power struggle. I might be a little passive aggressive, angry and frustrated, or I might have feelings of resentment. And then finally, we have the perfectionist mindset. And the thinking patterns when I engage in a situation through a perfectionist mindset lens is that nothing is ever good enough. Nothing meets my standards. That creates the situation, the behavior, where I end up correcting others based on my perception. I always think I'm right. I might step on other people's toes, attack leadership. And some people might say that I am hard to work with. So these are cognitive distortions that impact our ability to stay in our optimal performance range. And it's really important to acknowledge that we all have these cognitive distortions, right? And it might look differently for people, but most of us experience multiple of these on any given day. And we also know that we work with people who also experience cognitive distortions on any given day. So, in order to change and in order to impact these cognitive distortions, we have to change our way of thinking and responding in order to make a difference with the situation or in the situation at hand, right? So, we have to acknowledge that we have to make a change in order for the situation to change. Oftentimes in frustrating situations, we try to put the change on other people. What do they need to do to change to make the situation better? But it's really important for us to reflect on, what can I do to change to make the situation better? Reflection is key. Anytime we are dealing with any escalated situation, any escalated individual, reflecting on our own practices is so important. So I'm gonna have you all pause this recording and so that you can turn and talk or reflect if you don't have anybody to turn and talk with. Which cognitive distortions do you find affect you? What would happen to your stress level if you were able to change your thinking patterns? And what do you need to do to change any cognitive distortions that are not helpful in managing your stress or that of the students or individuals that you support? So go ahead and pause on this screen to reflect on this and consider these questions, and I will see you in a minute when you catch up. We're now going to start talking about self-care. Because what we know about self-care is that individuals who maintain a high level of wellness cope more effectively when witnessing a crisis, right? When seeing what is going on in the classroom or seeing a student escalated. And so what you see to the right of you on the screen is a wellness wheel. Now you can find many different variations of wellness wheels online. You can Google wellness wheel and a bunch will come up. And I'm going to explain the breakdown and then explain some activities that you can do with the wellness wheel. These 6 components of the wellness wheel are all really important to one's own self-care. And all of our wellness wheels look different from each other, right? Because all of us have a different level of need in each of these components. For me personally, my physical component is really high. I need to maintain a healthy work-life balance. I need to maintain working out, eating healthy for myself, and sleeping well at night. Those are critical for me to be my best self. When we go down to spiritual, when we're talking about spiritual, we're really talking about our values and morals, right? And for some people, church is extremely important for them. And that's great. That's what they ground themselves in. So when you think about your spiritual well-being, how important are really focusing on the people in your life who hold high values and high morals, the same values and the same morals with you, right? Where does church fit in, or some type of religious organization? Social has to do with the community that you keep, right? Your friends, your family. Obviously, during the COVID pandemic, our social circles have looked quite a bit different, right? A lot of us have had to do our own reflection on who is in our bubble. And that's what the social circle has to do about, or the social component, right? How important is that social element for you? For individuals where the social element has been really important for them, they have been impacted by COVID this year. Think about our own students. Emotional is all about your emotional well-being. right? How important it is for you to seek support, to have conversations with people about your emotional well-being, right? To feel supported by others in your life. Intellectual has to do with your own personal intellectual growth, whether that be self-reading, right? Self-help books, whether that be reading education books, whether that be going out to get various degrees, right? That intellectual component. And then, of course, the finance and occupation. How satisfied are you at work and financially? All right. So when we have the strongest self-care is when we find a solid balance within this wellness wheel for ourselves. Again, I want you to reflect or turn and talk. What do you do for self-care for yourself? What does this look like for you? And I am going to continue. And I also want to note that this is an activity, the wellness wheel is an activity that you can do with colleagues. You could do it at the beginning of the year, do a check-in at the in December, right? See where you're all at, do some goal setting with each other. It's also something you can do with your students. This is a great way to get to know your students more, have them color in the components. That's a great way. Get blank copies of a wellness wheel and just color in where are you at intellectually? Where are you at socially? Right? And start engaging in conversation about that. All right. So we're going to start moving into really understanding the de-escalation proponent of this and what do the skills look like. It is critical that you have a relationship with your students. And by that, I mean you should know all of your students' motivations. What are they motivated by? And what are they triggered by? You also need to consider if when a student is escalated, are you the best person to de-escalate that student? Are there other adults who might better support that student? And consider what support system is in place. Who can you reach out to for your students? And finally, you need to know and follow any plan that is already in place for that student. And I put a little asterisk next to plan because one of the biggest mistakes that educators do or the education system does is they substitute a plan for a person. So if I have a student who gets escalated frequently, and every single time that student gets escalated, I get called on the walkie to come de-escalate him, that's not a plan, that's a person. Because what that means is that we are having that student rely on one individual, and that's not healthy. It's not healthy for anybody. What happens if I'm absent? What happens when a student moves on to a different grade, a different school, right? We need to have a plan in place that is not reliant on one adult in the building. Now, it's okay for your students to have their adults that they feel most connected to, but it should not be one adult. It should be a handful of adults, and a plan should not be written around an adult. It should be written around what are the needs of the student. And of course, one response does not fit all, right? When we talk about the right response for engaging and supporting our youth, we're talking about it being proactive. It's information that we have already thought about. It's things that we have planned for when the situation occurs. It's also holistic. We are thinking about the entire student, not just the tunnel vision of the student when they're escalated, but the whole student, the whole situation. And it's immediately effective. Now, this doesn't mean that the second you start engaging in these de-escalation skills, that the escalation is going to immediately stop. But it means that we will immediately start to see changes. And we think about this a lot like the fire person concept, right? Like a fireman. Individuals that fight fires only fight fires about 10% of their career. The 90% rest of their career is all on preventative measures. It's all on education. It's all around safety. That's how we should see ourselves. We don't want to be putting out fires all year round. We don't want to be playing whack-a-mole all year round. What can we do to prevent the behavior from happening and be proactive and continually reassessing the situation? In addition to the concept that one response is not going to fit all, there are 3 guiding principles of right response, which really should just be 3 guiding principles for educators. When we engage in an intervention, it must meet the needs of our student. If it's not meeting the needs, why are we wasting our time? We must constantly reflect respect on the student. We need to reflect respect on the student even when they are engaging in behavior that is disrespectful. We still have to engage in respectful behavior. And the safety of everyone in the environment is of highest priority, including the escalated student. So to begin, unplug from the power struggle, right? Only teach when the student and you are in a place to use your thinking brain. Assess yourself in the situation. Be open to input from your team members. Sometimes other people who are outside of the situation can see into the situation much better than we can when we are in the situation. And work on meeting the student's needs versus requiring compliance. What need does the student have? Let's work on that. Let's focus on that. And part of this work is about shifting our focus. Oftentimes we have a short-term focus, but ideally we want to shift into a long-term focus with our students, right? A short-term focus is plugging in an intervention. The long-term focus is how do we prevent the behavior from happening so we don't have to plug in an intervention. A short-term focus is reaction. The long-term focus is know what to prevent so that we can engage in preventative behaviors. A short-term focus is to seek a shifting of the relationship. The long-term focus is building a lasting relationship. And again, that short-term focus is safety resolution. The long-term focus is problem resolution. And so we want to make sure that we are focusing on the long-term goals rather than just the short-term goals. There will be times where we need to focus on the short-term goals, right? If a student is extremely escalated and there's a concern about safety, I am going to consider safety resolution before I consider problem resolution, right? There will, of course, be times where we have to do a short-term focus to de-escalate the situation in the moment. But the goal is that over time, we're able to engage in the long-term focus. And I know that we've talked about this before, but when we talk about behavior, when we talk about our students significantly escalated, our students engaging in inappropriate behavior, we first need to consider what is the function of their behavior, because all behavior is communication. What is the student trying to gain? Is it attention? Is it something tangible? Is it sensory? Or what is the student trying to avoid? Is it attention? Is it something tangible? Or is it sensory? Those 3 pieces, attention, tangible, and sensory are the only functions that we talk about in terms of what the student is gaining or avoiding. Every type of behavior can fall into one of those three things. Prevention is the dominant paradigm in behavior management. We want to focus our time and our energy on preventing the behaviors so that they don't happen in the classroom. So I have created a list of examples of prevention opportunities for when a student engages in specific behaviors. These are things that you can do on the spot immediately to prevent the behavior from happening. So when a student is trying to escape, trying to avoid a task, or escape the environment, these are examples of preventative strategies. Adjust the difficulty of the task, offer choices, increase student interest in the activity, alter the length of the task, modify the mode of task completion. Does it have to be handwritten or can it be typed up? Can it be auditory and scribed down for the student? I'm telling you now, for trauma-informed practices, increasing the predictability in your classroom is key. Students that have a lot of chaos going on outside of their home or in their home, students that are impacted by significant trauma, neglect, stress, the more we can increase predictability in the classroom, the safer it will feel for them. Modify your instructional delivery. What are other ways that the instruction can be delivered? And provide a non-contingent escape. Give the student break opportunities. Not when you finish this, then you can do this, but hey, why don't you go take a 5-minute break and then we can get back to the task. If a student is trying to gain sensory reinforcement, provide an alternative sensory reinforcement, right? What do you have in your classroom that could be used as a sensory reinforcement? Enrich the environment with colors, right? With maybe some sounds, some different visuals. When a student is trying to gain a tangible or gain some type of activity reinforcement, this is when we want to schedule a preferred transitional activity. Moving from one activity to a next, what's something you can put in between there that is an exciting activity for the student? Increase the accessibility to the preferred item or activity. What can the student do to have access to that preferred item or that preferred activity? And this is when we want to provide the desired item or desired activity only contingent on an alternative appropriate response, or only when the challenging behavior is not present. And so what that means is, for example, if the student's desired item is an iPad, we would only allow access to the iPad when we do not see inappropriate behavior and when the student is engaging in the desired behavior. The student is completing the task that we requested from them. They then earn that activity or that item. If a student is trying to gain attention, it's really important that we determine who the student is trying to gain attention from, because if the student is trying to gain attention from another student and I'm giving them the attention, they're still going to do stuff to try to gain attention from the other student. So schedule that attention, right? If it's to you, increase that proximity to the student. Put a hand on the kid's shoulder. If attention is not available and the student is engaging in appropriate behavior, provide a preferred activity. And provide attention contingent on acceptable behavior or the non-occurrence of the challenging behavior. So do not be giving attention to the student when they're engaging in inappropriate behavior, because they'll keep doing it. We give attention to the behavior we want to see. So here's another opportunity to pause and reflect, either with somebody or on your own. What are some challenges that you have around using preventative strategies? What has not worked? What preventative strategies have worked well? How have you seen your school and classroom environment impact preventative strategies? And if you are a PBIS school, how have you seen positive behaviors and intervention support system impact the preventative strategies in your school? Feel free to stay on here and reflect for a little bit. So now I'm going to move into some very specific tips in the moment when a student is escalated and this student is impacted by trauma. The first thing to do is you want to be empathetic. Avoid using judgment. Avoid discounting their feelings. Whether or not you think that those feelings are justified, they are real to the student experiencing them. So just sit with that. Allow that to happen. Pay attention to the student. Hear them. Validate them. Again, use empathy. I hear what you're saying. I hear how mad you are. I see you are so frustrated, right? Use language like that. Respect the student's personal space. Right? Allowing personal space tends to decrease our anxiety because the closer we get, the more the student might get anxious about that. So if possible, standing a 1.5 to 3 feet away is really helpful. Still being there for the student, but just allowing some of that space. Use non-threatening nonverbals. The more a student loses control, the less they hear us, the more they react to our nonverbal communication. So it's really important for us to be mindful of our gestures, of our facial expressions, of our movement, and our tone of voice. I tend to be a really fast talker, and I'm also just like a fast mover in general, and I'm very animated. I talk with my hands. Every time I get my nails done, I am reminded of that because they tell me to stop talking because I talk with my hands too much. When I am working with a student that is escalated, I purposefully take a breath in between my words. I talk slower. I talk more at a monotone. I hear what you're saying. I see you are really frustrated. I'm here with you. I'm supporting you, right? I talked slower. I talk at a lower tone and I move slower. In fact, I typically hold my hands and put them in my lap or I put them in my pockets. I walk into the student space. I do not rush into the student space. We have to be mindful of that. And paralanguage. Paralanguage is really important for us to think about, and I'll give you some examples. But paralanguage is not the words that are coming out of our mouth, but how we are saying the words. Okay, so take this sentence, for example. I didn't tell Joe you were incompetent. Right? Now listen to the difference. I didn't tell Joe you were incompetent. I told the other guy, but not Joe, right? I didn't tell Joe you were incompetent. I told him you were stupid, but I didn't tell him you were incompetent. I didn't tell Joe you were incompetent. I emailed him, but I didn't tell him, right? Sometimes our students, based on how we are saying something, will try to read between the lines, even if that isn't our intention. So again, staying at a monotone, not using inflection for any specific words is really important when a student is escalated, because again, they're not necessarily hearing the words coming out of our mouth, but they're looking at us, they're hearing the tone and the inflection, the cadence of how we say it. I put this little emoji up because, as we know, paralanguage mistakes happen a lot in writing. Okay, this happens all the time. Think about the last text message that you got that was just said, okay, just the letters, okay, or just the letter K, right? When I get a text message and it just says K, I automatically assume that that person must be mad at me, or I did something wrong, or they didn't like my answer. Versus okay, exclamation point, where it was like, okay, yeah, we're good, we're on the same page, right? So this type of thing we have to be cautious about in our writing as well. We also want to avoid overreacting, because if we overreact, right, if we're thinking through that polarity mindset, so we think that something's a massive emergency and we react like that, that can actually increase the student's escalation. So we need to remain calm, rational, professional. We cannot control our students' behavior, right? We are only in control of ourselves, but how we respond to their behavior will have a direct effect on whether the escalation increases or decreases. And we want to have the escalation decrease. So staying calm and rational and professional is so important. And we want to focus on their feelings. We know that the facts are important and we will get to the facts, but how our students feel, that's really the heart of the matter. Oftentimes an escalation occurs because a student feels like harm has been done towards them. Many students have trouble identifying how they feel about what's happening to them. They don't have that self-awareness skill. So watch them and listen to them for their real message. Maybe when they get super angry, it's that they're embarrassed. Maybe when they get super angry, it's that they're sad, right? So really listen for their real message. And it's okay to say, to put in words, right? To teach some of that language of emotion. It's actually helpful. This one is really important. Ignore challenging questions. When our students are escalated, sometimes they do want to engage in a power struggle. Sometimes it feels good to them. It's not helpful, right? Answering challenging questions often just results in a power struggle. When a student challenges your authority, just redirect their attention to the issue at hand or even walk away from the situation. That's best practice. Do not engage in a power struggle. I've tried it before. You won't win. And make sure that you do set limits, that you know what your boundaries are. You know what the boundaries are of your building, of your classroom. If a student's behavior becomes significantly disruptive, maybe defensive, or even belligerent at sometimes, you need to be able to give them clear and enforceable limits, right? We're talking 3 to 5 words in a sentence here. Be concise and be respectful, and let them know what their choices are. Let them know what happens, what those consequences are, positive and negative. That is really important too, so that we put it back on the student to make the decision for their behavior, right? That acknowledgement that they are accountable for their behavior. And choose wisely what you insist upon. It's really important to be thoughtful in deciding what rules are negotiable and what rules are not. For example, right, if a student doesn't want to complete a math worksheet first thing in the morning, can you allow them to choose the time of day that feels best for them? These are the times when I'm going to say, pick your battles. There are going to be times when students purposefully try to challenge you. And the best thing to do is be like, you know what? That's great. What time do you want to finish the math worksheet then? right? You don't want to sit there today? Okay, where would you like to sit? And I'm going to put your name on that desk, so that's going to be your seating assignment. Right? Determine what really are those things that are non-negotiables in the classroom, and then the things that are negotiables. Power struggles are the biggest waste of time, I'm telling you. And then one that we often don't speak about enough, that is so important, is silence. Sometimes it feels counterintuitive or even counterproductive to let moments of silence occur, but sometimes it's the best choice. It can give our students a chance to really reflect on what's happening, to do some processing on their own, take some time to think, and that can sometimes be enough to help them start the de-escalation process. We also want to make sure that we are allowing time for decisions. When an individual is upset, they are usually challenged to think clearly because they're not in that prefrontal cortex. They're not using their thinking brain. They're in their survival brain. Give them time to think through what you have said. If you have outlined choices, if you have outlined consequences, give them time to process it before making them make a decision. And then we need to engage in what we call postvention teaching, right? Reestablishing the proactive environment and creating a teachable moment. This is when the reflection occurs. Now, what we know about postvention teaching is we have to have a student completely back at baseline before we engage in postvention teaching. They cannot be in the exhaustion stage because that will usually spike them back up into an escalation. They have to be calm, cool, and collected for us to engage in this conversation. And we have the discussion with them. We talk to them about what happened. We talk to them about other choices or opportunities, what they could do next time, what you could do differently next time. And then you both come up with some commitments that you can make with each other to avoid situations like this. Have that conversation, build that relationship with them so that you can create this teachable moment. So here's another opportunity to either reflect or do a turn and talk. But consider the last time that your team or you managed an incident, an escalation. What went well? What led to the success? How could your team duplicate that success? What could have been done differently? And what can your team learn from this? Right? How will this be applied to prevent incidents in the future? So again, this is time for you to pause the recording and do some reflection. And thank you all so much for participating in this with me today. Here is my information. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. My email is tova@innovativebehaviors.org, and I look forward to working with you and seeing you all next week. Thank you.